Hi, my name is Tabitha Santos, and I have an analytical IOP, and today I'll be analyzing evil in Stephen King's The Green Mile. My thesis statement is, the purpose of this is to show Stephen King's depiction of evil in The Green Mile and how it personifies evil, making evil a character and eventually the main antagonist of The Green Mile. Focal points in my analysis will be how Stephen King uses word choice and imagery to depict evil in The Green Mile, how evil becomes tangible, and finally, how evil is the antagonist. Left versus right. So on the left is life, and on the right is death. Left could also be considered good, because you live, and right could be considered evil, because that's where you meet Old Sparky, and that's where the condemned go to die. So refer to quote 1, where it talks about how left is life, and next refer to quote 2, where it talks about how right is death, and an example of left versus right is quote 3, where Paul states that he is glad to see that Bev went left rather than right. Word choice and imagery. So most of the word choice and imagery is said by Paul Edgecombe, the protagonist. And I believe that Stephen King's perception of evil is portrayed through the protagonist. And evil's first talked about in relation to the characters in The Green Mile. Percy Wetmore. So Percy Wetmore is described as someone unkind, cynical, a cruel boy. These are all characteristics of evil. So, for example, Paul says that he's a man too squeamish to kill and cook his own meat, but who did all the same just love the smell of a barbecue. Paul also says that he had the heart of a cruel boy who goes to the zoo not to study the animals, but to throw stones at them in their cages. So this quote reminds me of Percy's behavior towards Edward Delacroix, and how Edward had lesser power than Percy Wetmore, so he was able to take advantage of him and treat him much like animals in the zoo. Paul also says that he had the look of a man who has discovered he can wait for the things that he wants. And this reminds me of a malevolent presence. Evil is also depicted through weather, and every time weather was bad, it was foreshadowing evil on The Green Mile. For example, Brutus says, "I don't like this weather much. It feels like something's going to happen, something bad." So the presence of evil is here, and Delacroix's execution goes horribly wrong. There's also often thunder and harsh and loud sounds on the roof outside of the penitentiary, and that is a foreshadow of evil in a different form. I have 2 more examples, and the third example is it's the scene where Paul is with his wife, Jan Edgecombe, and she's dying, and it's rainy and gray outside, and John Coffey's not there to combat against the evil. How evil becomes tangible. So evil becomes tangible when John Coffey is introduced, who is an inmate or a condemned man on The Green Mile. And I believe that he's the direct line to evil, because when we first meet evil, when we first see evil physically, we see it in the form of black-like insects, or like a dark cloud. And we also see evil as something more tangible and separate from the human when we see John Coffey and Bill Wharton's encounter. So Wharton grabs John Coffey, and John Coffey feels evil inside of Bill Wharton, much like he did when he healed Paul's urinary infection, and much like when he healed Mr. Jingles, but this is a new kind of evil. Wharton was similar to the kind of evil that we usually think of, which is pure and incapable of humanity. And John had a direct contact with the evil inside of Bill Wharton. So please refer to quote 15 and quote 16. And this is just the scene where John Coffey and Bill Wharton are together, and John Coffey feels a presence inside of Bill Wharton, but it's much colder than Paul's presence and Mr. Jingles' presence. So I believe that Wharton is a vessel for the evil that resides in him, and Coffey can actually feel the evil within Wharton like he could Mr. Jingles, but it's different because Wharton seems like a truly evil person. So I also think that evil becomes tangible and physical when we have the scene between John Coffey and Melinda Moores, because you can physically see what evil has done to Melinda, like in her face, in her behavior, and the way that she is after she found out that she had a brain tumor. And Paul quotes and says, "The thing in her head must have moved with horrifying speed to consolidate its position." So this is an example of how evil is a separate presence now from the human. It's different. It's not just part of a human, but rather something separate from him. So Paul also hints that Melinda Moores looks like she's possessed. He says, "I'm not saying that Melinda Moores was possessed, and I'm aware, wrought up as I was, all my perceptions of that night must be suspect, but I have never completely discounted the possibility of demonic possession." So evil is compared to a demon, so something that is living. At this point of the novel, evil is definitely depicted as the antagonist. So again, Melinda Moores is not herself, and John Coffey reminds me of the hero of the novel, and in this scene he goes against not Melinda Moores, but the evil inside of Melinda Moores. And this is kind of like this is a perfect example of good versus evil. So quote 20, I feel, is the most important quote because it talks about how old Sparky never burned what was inside of them, and the drugs they inject them with today to keep them to sleep, but the evil vacates and jumps from someone else and leaves the husks that aren't really alive anyway. So evil is something that can live inside a person, but it's not that person. Like old Sparky kills the host of evil, but evil doesn't die. So, for example, evil goes from Melly, from Melinda Moores, to Coffey, and then Coffey transfers the evil to Percy, in which Percy, the evil inside of Percy, is used to kill Bill Warren. Antagonist. A person who actively opposes or is hostile to someone or something. So although evil isn't a person, it definitely appears as a character. For example, Percy and Wild Bill are evil, but Melinda is an example of evil taking away someone's innocence, like using their body for their tasks. So the people in the story are not the antagonist, but what is inside them is. Like usually you'd see Percy Wetmore or Bill Wharton as the antagonist, but it's rather something that's inside of them that makes them evil. To me, again, the hero is not Paul, but rather John Coffey, because John Coffey has the tools to combat against the malevolent presence in the Green Mile. Evil is the villain. And Paul says, I think of John saying that Wharton killed the Dedrick twins with their love for each other, and that happens every day all over the world. So there's an emphasis on the he, because Wharton can't be everywhere at once. So obviously John Coffey is not talking necessarily about Bill Wharton, but rather evil. And at this point, evil's a living thing, and it's like a parasite, and it's definitely the antagonist on the Green Mile. So, evil as a character. This quote is also important because this is the third reference of evil being a demon, or evil being capable of possessing someone. So it says, "But I believe there's another force as well, one every bit as real as the God I have prayed through my whole life, and that it works consciously to bring all our dissent impulses to ruin. Not Satan, I don't mean Satan, although I believe he's real, but a kind of demon of discord, a prankish and stupid thing that laughs with glee when an old woman sets herself on fire trying to let his pipe out, or when a much-loved baby puts his first Christmas toy in its mouth and chokes to death on it." So that force was actively working among us that morning, swirling everywhere like a fog, trying to keep John Coffey away from Melinda Morse. In this scene, Paul is talking about the malevolent presence that he felt before entering Warden Hal Morse's house, and he feels evil, and evil is definitely there. Evil has developed into a character separate from the people that it uses their body. Evil is separate than the person that evil uses their body for. So evil as the antagonist. I believe that evil is the winner because it never dies. And Paul has come to the acceptance that evil never dies, and he says that we each owe a death, there are no exceptions. I know that sometimes, oh God, the Green Mile is so long. He's accepted that there can't always be good in the world, but that good and evil is always going to coincide together. And also that evil can be in anyone. So he also describes the evil that took away his friends and family, which were the strokes, the cancers, the heart attacks, the liver diseases, the blood diseases. But Paul thinks that the worst kind of evil that was done to him was that he was left untouched, and he feels like this was his punishment for killing the only thing that could go against evil, which was John Coffey. An example of evil being able to jump from body to body is Brad Dolan. When Brad Dolan is first introduced, Paul says that he reminds him of Percy, and this is another example of how evil comes in different forms and it's always alive. So in my conclusion, it says, through word choice and imagery, evil becomes tangible, furthermore becoming the main antagonist of the novel. So interactions with and through the characters of the novel have allowed evil to become their own character. I have come to the conclusion that evil is not a part of someone, but separate, and it uses the human body as a host for their tasks. So I refer to evil as they and them now because they are a character. And